first or simple electrical devices at the time of galvanometry is used, it was the galvanometer. Now the advanced form of galvanometer is called ECG. To get better idea about the galvanometer and to know about some principles of the ECG, first of all I draw here a simple picture of the heart. Simple picture of the heart. First I remove a small piece of this from atrium and I put this small piece here, and this galvanometer may be rectangular and maybe circular. This galvanometer is made from one pointer or needle of the galvanometer. The second two electrode, one is a positive electrode and another is negative electrode. Now we should know how the galvanometer works. And this is called the 4 or 5 experience about the basic and principle of the ECG. Principle number 1, we remove a small piece from the atrial tissues, and I put this atrial tissue here. As you know, atrial tissue is a thin tissue. It is made from less cells, and they need for less sodium for depolarization, and they produce small weak or small weak, not strong, small weak deflection. In contrast to ventricular cell is thicker and made from more cell and need more sodium, and they produces a strong deflection. First we depolarize this patient. Now you suppose this piece is not depolarized. When the cell is not depolarized, or when the cell is not loaded by sodium, or when the cell is not going under depolarization and depolarization, the needle of galvanometer remains at 0 position and does not fluctuate. Right now we stimulate this piece by sodium. Atrial depolarization depends on sodium. For example, if you think that the SNO stimulates this cell, or we stimulate this cell, and sodium is coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell. And this cell was first before depolarization was in a polarized state. It means inside the cell and outside the cell before depolarization are equal. So and therefore the ECG needle does not move to any side. This cell we still not depolarized. This is not undergoing depolarization and depolarization. There is no voltage difference between outside the cell and inside the cell. There is no difference in electrical potential between outside the cell and inside the cells. Right now we want to depolarize this cell. When sodium is entering into this cell, the first group of cells is first depolarized. And this first group of cells lead to depolarization of the second, and second lead to depolarization of the third, and third to fourth. As soon as this piece is depolarized, the needle of galvanometer starts deflection. So this time this positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, the deflection would be toward the positive. As you mentioned, galvanometer is used for detection of the electrical force. Deflection of the needle represents that piece is alive and it has got electrical activity. So this detection of the electrode is represented by the deflection of the needle. And measuring of the electrical force. How much electrical force is produced by this piece? This is also by needle of galvanometer is measured. When the needle is deflected, it comes to 0.2. We will get 0.2 millivolt electricity or electric. So detection of the electrical force. Detection of the electrical force is presented by deflection of the needle of galvanometer. The amount of the electrical force represents, for example, 0.2 millivolt. The direction of the electrical flow from A side to B side. It means this positive deflection goes toward the positive electrode. The deflection in the needle would be positive. So, and the second thing, galvanometer which provide for us about the speed of the electricity. So atrial tissue is supplied by the moderate conduction system. So this needle come to 0.2 and then slightly goes back. Because in atrial tissue is supplied by the moderate conduction system. So the needle moderately deflect from 0 to 2 and then slowly come back to 0 point. Did you catch?
Yes.
The simple experience or the first experience. We have got a piece of myocard. This piece is not stimulated, or this piece is not loaded by the sodium, and this piece not is going under depolarization and depolarization. So and therefore the galvanometer needle remains constant or remains at 0 position. And inside the cell and outside the cell are electrically equal. So and therefore the needle does not fluctuate to any size. Right now we immediately stimulate this piece and we loaded some sodium to this piece of myocardial tissue. There are a lot of sodium are coming through the rapid voltage gated sodium channel, and this first group of cells, second group of cells, step by step is depolarized, and finally the positive charge moves toward the positive electrode and deflection would be toward the positive. This is one of the most important principles of the ECG. When positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, deflection in the needle would be positive. So this atrial tissue extended the ventricular tissue, so the electrical force which is produced by this thin atrial tissue, it is less than the ventricular tissue. Because thicker tissue needs more sodium and they produce large deflection. Small tissue needs less sodium and they produce small or weak deflection. This is another principle of the ECG. Left ventricle is thicker. Left ventricle is thicker and they need more sodium. And when it contracts or when it is depolarized, they produce large deflection. While atrial tissue is thin and it's made from small cells and they need less sodium. And when the deflection of the atrial tissue produces weak deflection. For example, this is about the ventricle. And for the atrial tissue, this one. What is the reason? Left ventricle is thicker. This piece is thicker than that thicker. So the deflection is a large deflection. This is experience number 2. Right now we remove a piece from left ventricle because the left ventricle is a little bit thicker than the atrium, or even in the rest of the heart, left ventricle is thicker. It is made from more cell. It needs more sodium. It produces long deflections, a strong deflection. For this reason, still we first you should think this piece is not stimulated. When this piece, this thicker piece that I remove from the ventricle, when it is not stimulated, it is unstimulated, still depolarization and repolarization does not occur in this piece. The needle does not fluctuate to any side. Immediately we again stimulate this piece and the electrical discharge, which was previously negative, it was become positive. Now we are talking about the thick piece of myocardium. We remove this thick from left ventricle and I put here. Still this piece, like first experience, is not stimulated. This is unstimulated. There is no depolarization and depolarization. There is no sodium, or the sodium are not coming through the rapid voltage gated channel to this cells, and the needle does not fluctuate to any side. When the needle does not fluctuate to any side, if we stimulate this piece, immediately sodium is coming. There are a lot of sodium are coming from outside the cell to the inside the cell. And first group first stimulated, then second, then third, and then fourth. Finally, this positive charge moves toward the positive electrode. You think this is positive electrode, and this is a negative electrode. The rule number 2, when positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, the deflection in the needle would be positive. Still right. Since this tissue is thicker than this piece, the deflection was a large deflection. For example, the left ventricle produced 1 millivolt. 1 millivolt. Thicker tissue produce large amount of the electrical force. This thicker tissue produce large deflection. So the needle of the galvanometer may reach up to 1 millimeter, and the previous experience it reached to 0.1. This was principle number 2. Second and the third thing that you say, the needle of galvanometer during the ventricular depolarization goes fastly. Why atrial tissue conduction is slow, but ventricular tissue have got rapid conduction? Because ventricular tissue is supplied by Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells is a fast cell. So the needle is fastly go here and then come back to the 0 position. the last thing, this is take a strong deflection and it is supplied by rapid conduction system, rapidly conduct the electrical force, and finally the wave of depolarization which is produced by this thicker tissue, it is a large wave of depolarization. And still positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, the deflection in the needle would be positive. This was about the difference between myocardial tissue and arterial tissues. Arterial tissue produces small deflection. Ventricular tissue produces large deflection. Arterial tissue is supplied by moderate conduction system, slowly conduct the electrical impulse, while ventricular tissue is supplied by rapid conduction system. I mean Purkinje fiber. Purkinje fiber rapidly conduct the electrical impulse. Since like this first experience, the positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, the deflection still is a positive. This was experience number 2. We will come to the experience number 3. This time, again, this is a piece of myocardium which is not stimulated. It is unstimulated. Still, depolarization and depolarization does not occur. Still, the sodium is not coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell. From the outside the cell into the inside the cell. Then you want to, if the cell is not coming from outside the cell, or sodium is not coming to outside the cell to the inside, and no depolarization, the needle would be constant or remains at 0 position. Right now we again stimulate this piece. This piece, sodium is coming, and this first group of the cell become positive. Then the third group leads to fourth group, fourth leads to 5. And finally this piece of myocardial completely depolarized. When the cell is completely depolarized, what will happen to the galvanometer needle? The galvanometer needle does not fluctuate to any side. When the ventricle is completely depolarized, they do not accept further stimulation. If there is further stimulation occurs, what will happen to this piece? This patient may develop premature bleed. When myocardial cell, or when this piece of myocardium is completely depolarized, during completely depolarization, the cell does not accept any further stimulation. If they accept this stimulation leads to arrhythmia and possibly lead to start VPC. So when the cells or a piece of myocardium or all myocardial tissues are completely depolarized, the needle of the ECG machine does not move to any side. For example, after the QRS complex, we have got ST segment. This ST segment is compatible to this experience. During this ST segment produced, the ventricle is completely depolarized. Until the depolarization of the ventricle is completed, the needle of the ECG machine does not fluctuate to any side, and it remains constant. If there is further stimulation occurs, the patient may develop arrhythmia. This is a dangerous form that you want to stimulate this piece during this phase that is completely depolarized. Now experience number 4. Now this time we start the stimulation from here. In the first experience from negative, the second experience from negative, or the third also from the negative, and this time we will start depolarization from positive. This is another principle of the ECG. When positive charge moves toward the
negative side.
When the positive charge moves away from positive electrode, what will happen to the deflection of the needle of the ECG machine? Negative deflection. Especially this is more common in chest leads. Chest lead or small heart septal or then negative wave. The principle number 4, when positive charge moves away from positive electrode, the deflection in the needle will be negative. Principle number 4. Now we will come to the repolarization. As I mentioned, the differences between repolarization and depolarization is started from endocard. Repolarization is start from pericard. You think this is pericard, this is myocard, and this is endocard. Then this, when we stimulate from depolarization is started from in to out. Repolarization is start from out to in. First they lead to pericard depolarization, after the pericard myocard, and finally endocard. This time the negative charge, this is repolarization is a negative movement. During repolarization, the cell is getting negative electrical charge. So repolarization is a negative charge. Then the negative charge moves toward the negative electrode. The deflection in the needle would be positive. Physics, in the physics, same charge goes through the same charge, the deflection in the needle would be positive. The negative charge moves toward the negative, the deflection is positive. Positive charge moves toward the positive, the deflection is positive. When positive charge moves away from the electrode, the deflection in the needle would be negative. Thick part produce strong deflection, small part produce small deflection. I will summarize today's lecture by comparison of this chart. What is depolarization? We will have a detailed discussion about the action potential, and in the chapter of the action potential, we will give a complete information about the depolarization. Here, depolarization is a positive movement. What does it mean, positive movement? Normally, cell have got an electrical voltage of minus 90 millivolt. Minus 90 millivolt. And if this piece is not stimulated outside the cell and inside the cell are electrically equivalent, and they don't accept further stimulation, and the needle does not fluctuate to any side. As soon as we stimulate or we start depolarization, this depolarization, first group of cells, second and third, and finally all of these pieces, the electrical force goes to the positive charge and deflection in the needle will be positive. So during depolarization or polarized state, the sodium is coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell. The sodium is coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell. So depolarization, why is a positive movement? Because the sodium is coming and this electrical negativity is converted by coming of the sodium from outside the cell into the inside the cell, and the cell become getting positively charged. That is why depolarization is positive movement. It means when we are talking about the positive movement, it means the sodium are coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell in the case of the atrium, ventricular cell and Purkinje fiber. But in case of SN node and AV node, calcium is coming from outside the cell into the inside the cell. So that is why the cell is getting positive charge. So depolarization is a positive movement. What is the repolarization? During repolarization, the cell is gaining back a negative electrical charge. It goes back to minus 90 millivolt. So repolarization is a negative movement. Depolarization of the cells depend upon the sodium, especially which cells? Atrium cells, ventricular cells, and Purkinje cells. Their depolarization are related to the sodium. While depolarization is always open to potassium. Why ventricle is supplied by fast conduction system? Because sodium is a fast conduction system and potassium is a slow conduction system. This is another thing. Depolarization is start from the endocard and depolarization is start from pericard. Why depolarization is start from endocard? Because Purkinje cell is located deep in the endocard, and electrical impulse start from endocard, then myocard, and then go to pericard. In contrast, repolarization is start from pericard. You think this is pericard, this is myocard, this is endocard. And repolarization is a slow movement. And repolarization is a negative movement. During repolarization, the cell is getting a negative voltage of minus 90 millivolt. For atrial cell, ventricular cell, and Purkinje cell, the resting membrane potential is 90 millivolt. For SN node and AV node, the resting membrane potential is 60 millivolt. Depolarization is a fast movement, repolarization is a slow movement. Now, I will again repeat it or recap this one. What is the galvanometer? Galvanometer is an electromechanical instrument which is used for detection of the electricity, measurement of the electricity, speed of the electricity, and direction of the electrical force. Or in a simple word, galvanometer is a small electromechanical instrument which converts electrical force to mechanical force. Mechanical force. What are the main parts of the galvanometer? Galvanometer is made from three main parts. One, magnetic needles. The second, coil and magnetic field. And the fourth, The fourth is electrode, two electrodes. Galvanometer, just the aim of the galvanometer at that time it is discovered just information about the matter of the life. If this tissue or this object is alive or dead. So galvanometer just provide at that time this type of information. But the advanced form of a galvanometer is ECG machine. What are the differences between ECG machine and galvanometer? Galvanometer just made from three parts, for example, needle, electrode, and coil in electromagnetic field. So galvanometer is not fitted by motor. Galvanometer is not fitted by motor. Galvanometer does not use the ECG paper. So and therefore galvanometer does not provide information about the whole myocardium, just provide information about the matter of death and life. To get an ECG, or we record the electrical activity from outer surface of the body, we use ECG, and this ECG records the electrical activity of the heart from inside to the outside, and electrical force is detected by the 10 leads and then transmit to the ECG needle and produces deflection of the needle and produces different wave segment and intervals. But galvanometer does not do this thing, just provide information about the matter of death and life, or just provide about the detection, measuring speed and direction of the electrical forces.
How does it work?
How does it work? These examples are the mechanism by which galvanometer works. To get better idea about the function of galvanometer, we remove a small piece. For example, first we remove arterial tissue. A small piece of arterial tissue I put here. First, we do not stimulate this tissue. When the cell is not stimulated and this is unstimulated, it means there is no depolarization and depolarization. It means there is no sodium is coming from outside the cell and there is no potassium going from inside the cell and outside the cell. In such a case, inside the cell and outside the cell are electrically equal. And still, we do not stimulate this piece. If we stimulate this piece, immediately sodium is coming from outside the cell and inside the cell, and the first cell lead to depolarization of the second cell lead to depolarization of third cell. Likewise, the depolarization moves from A point to B point. This is a positive charge and this electrode is also a positive electrode. When positive charge moves toward the positive electrode, the deflection in the needle would be positive. If this piece is thin, our deflection of the needle would be small. If this piece is strong or thick, the deflection would be more. It means by thin tissue, the amount of electricity which is produced is less, and the needle is deflected 0.1 millivolt. If the tissue is thicker, for example, left ventricle, and lead to large deflection, and they produce large deflection. The second, this is, now we remove this part from ventricle. Ventricle tissue is a thicker tissue, and this tissue needs more sodium. More sodium produces large wave of depolarization. Large wave of depolarization produces large deflection or wave over the ECG paper. When a piece is completely depolarized, in this two experience, the cell is not completely depolarized, just the positive charge moves toward the positive electrode. If a cell or this piece is completely depolarized, what will happen to the galvanometer? Galvanometer machine does not work. In the two side does not work. When is the cell in the resting state, and the second when completely the cell is depolarized. If during this period we give stimulation for this piece, what will happen to this piece? The patient may develop arrhythmia. In this case, in the complete depolarization, the cell does not accept further stimulation. And that is why the needle of galvanometer does not fluctuate to any side and remains stable. This was another very important principle of the ECG. This time we start depolarization from B part. There is a positive electrode and there is a negative electrode. Now the positive charge moves away from the positive electrode. When the positive charge is away from the positive electrode, the deflection in the needle would be negative. Negative. Another depolarization starts from endocard, repolarization starts from pericard. The pericard, for example, first pericard, the second myocard, and finally endocard. Depolarization is a fast movement, repolarization is a slow movement. What is the reason? Because depolarization of the ventricle depends on the sodium. Sodium channel is a fast channel. They are fastly loaded the sodium from outside the cell into the inside the cell. Depolarization is a positive movement. It means during depolarization the cell is gaining sodium. This is why this is a positive movement. Depolarization is a negative movement. During depolarization the cell is losing potassium from inside the cell to the outside the cell. Another differences between depolarization and depolarization. We have mentioned depolarization is a slow process, depolarization is fast process, repolarization slow process. What is the reason? Sodium channel is a fast channel, rapid voltage gated channel, and potassium channel is a slow channel. That is why depolarization is a fast process and depolarization is a negative process. Another example, this is the ECG, this is the P wave. We see the depolarization of the atrium, but we don't see the repolarization of the atrium. There is no any wave for the atrium here. So when this cell starts repolarization, the atrium is slow. Until they start and complete the repolarization, the ventricular depolarization starts immediately and strongly and with a very fast process. So this atrial depolarization is buried in this ventricular depolarization. That is why it is very important, the conduction system of the heart. For example, atrial tissue is supplied by slow conduction tissue and ventricular tissue is supplied by rapid conduction. The rapid conduction on the ventricle is depend on Purkinje cells, while repolarization is depend on the sodium. Atrial tissue is supplied by the moderate conduction system. Another large part reflect S anode and AV node. S anode is a very tiny tissue and a small tissue. They made from very small cell. The amount of cell which is made the S anode AV node very less. So this is a tiny tissue, and they need for depolarization calcium. The amount of calcium which is entering in the S anode is also less. Less cells need less calcium. Less cells produce small or tiny deflection. So we can record the electrical activity of the S anode AV node from inside of the body by inserting of a needle at the tip of this needle. When we put a small electrode, and then from femoral artery, finally we reach to the S anode. This S anode, we can record the electrical activity of the S anode from inside of the chest. Like AV node. That is why S anode, AV node, we don't have from S anode and AV node a wave or deflection over the ECG paper, because these are the tiny tissue made from less tissue. They need less calcium produces small deflection, and this deflection does not reach to the surface of the body to be detected by electrode. That is why S anode does not produce any large wave or strong wave. We see the effect of the S anode on the ECG indirectly, because this is the S anode which is the primary pacemaker, and this S anode stimulates atrial tissue. If we have got a well-defined P wave, it represents that is stimulated by the S anode. But from the AV node, we just have got pure segment. This is AV node. AV node is also a small tissue or a tiny tissue, and conduction in the AV node very slow. So the electrical force which is produced by AV node is very slow. So the needle does not fluctuate during the polarization of the AV node. When the needle does not depolarize, when the needle does not receive any deflection from the AV node, the needle of the ECG machine just occurs over the moving paper. Now, so S anode is a tiny tissue, small tissue. We don't have any wave of deflection from the S anode AV node, because this tiny tissue needs small amount of the sodium, and the wave of depolarization very small. That is why we don't have any wave and deflection from the S anode AV node over the ECG paper. Another principle. Yes. This was about today's lecture. Thank you for me.